Good afternoon. Thank you, everybody, for joining. My name is Michael Del Castillo, Senior Editor of Blockchain and Cryptocurrency at Forbes, here with Juan Bennett, the co-founder and CEO, the founder and CEO of
Protocol Labs.
Protocol Labs. For those that don't know what Protocol Labs is, let's do just a really quick overview of the company.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Excited to be here. So Protocol Labs is an innovation network. We're more than one company now. We're a network of different companies, and we're very focused on building better infrastructure for the internet that brings some of the benefits of decentralization and much more robust internet infrastructure to the world. So we want to build a structure for the internet that gives us permanence on the digital information and that puts users in control of their data.
Awesome. So that's why we're paying attention to Juan right there. We're going to get into some more details. But first, I want to go back in time a little bit with you. I want to get to know Juan as a person. So the first possible questions that one could ask about somebody: where were you born? And tell us a little bit about who your parents are.
Yeah. So I was born in Mexico. My family came from a few different places, from Mexico, Spain, and the U.S. My grandmother was actually here in New York, was born here. Her parents were off the boat immigrants in Ellis Island from Spain. And but yeah, I was born in Mexico. My family moved down there, and I grew up there until I was about 15, and then I moved to the U.S. For high school and college and so on. My parents, my mom is she's like a she studied literature and did a lot of translations for scientific magazines for a long time. And then she became a businesswoman, and she had her own business with real estate and so on in Mexico. And my dad was a university professor and newspaper editor for a long time.
All right.
He's one of the people that discovered
so you got some love of language in your family, huh?
Yeah.
All right, I like that. Just so happens to blur a little bit into the science area, which I'm sure we'll get a chance to talk about shortly. Yep. When you think back to those early years, first 15 years, you said you were in Mexico. Are there one or two sort of like anecdotes that jump out to you as kind of like a red flag, or this guy is going to grow up to found Protocol Labs?
I kind of grew up on the internet more than any one place. And so I started working with computers from very early, like 13, 14. I actually got into computers through games. And so I started learning how to make websites initially, and then understanding how the systems work and so on. So I don't know, maybe that, or
what about from like a moral or an ethical perspective, like the idea that you're specifically focused on decentralization? Was there an experience that you had early on with central authority, or that kind of like informed this awareness?
Yeah, absolutely. So growing up in Mexico, and this is one of the things that I think maybe sets aside my perspective from a lot of the other people in the industry. I grew up in a place that, super rich with people, natural resources, like goodwill of people and so on. And yet the systems and structures of Mexico have held back the entire nation. And there's a ton of corruption and other problems. And so I got a sense of just how problematic the underlying economic structures and the underlying governance systems could be for people. And when I came to the US, it was just a massive stark difference. I got a much higher functioning society. Laws worked much better, very much lower corruption. There's still corruption in the US, but lower, or at least not as directly entrenched in the day-to-day. And that gave me a deep appreciation for the importance of having good rule sets and people following those rule sets and good incentive structures and so on. Because a lot of the problems in Mexico stem from bad incentive structures. Like it is very difficult to make ends meet doing things honestly, and very difficult to build businesses and grow them within Mexico. And so many people end up turning to more shadier businesses because of that. And Mexico has suffered tremendously over the last century because of that.
It's fascinating that you put a point on the clarity of rule sets for the distinction between what you felt when you came to the States and what you were experiencing in Mexico. Might even be surprising for some people that like to think of America as the land of the free, right? What's the connection there between like freedom in big air quotes here, and the sort of functioning society that you experience, and
Yeah.
like it's a little counterintuitive, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think freedoms require a firm establishment of rights, and that includes limitations on what you can do. So, so in a sense, it's kind of paradoxical. In order to be free, you require that other parties respect your freedom and your freedoms or set of freedoms, and so you require some baseline set of rules by which everyone plays. And if people start deviating from those, then freedoms are eroded.
So we'll remember that, and we'll maybe come back to that when we get it later into the technology. You did a beautiful, concise description of your companies, which I would expect nonetheless since you founded them. I have heard you occasionally also, though, describe it in much more scientific terms than in terms of the internet. Before we go on, I just want to ask if you can kind of like flesh that out a little bit. So underneath the scenes here of reimagining the way that the internet works with less reliance on central authorities, perhaps maybe a little more clarity in rule sets. Like, what's the scientific aspect of what got you into this in the first place?
Yeah, so perhaps deeper than the Web3 push, there's this realization that just innovation and new technologies come in and improve our lives, but they take a very long time to build. And so you have this very long-term research and development pipeline where very early on, some research might take 5 to 10 to sometimes 20 years to translate into technologies that you can put into a product and then use. And so for Bell Labs used to have this like great quote where if you haven't sold an innovation in a market at a cheap enough price to be actually bought, then you haven't really innovated. And today, a lot of people think that you just have to do the research and come up with some conceptual breakthrough, and that's innovation. But in reality, innovation is a much longer process of going through turning those concepts into good prototypes, good proofs of concept, turning those into things that you can actually produce at scale, and then put into products to actually solve some problem. And once you've connected that innovative concept to an actual end user product that actually improves people's lives, then you've innovated. And that pipeline takes a long time. So for many things, it can be 10, 20 years, sometimes 40 years. And so there's some bottlenecks in that pipeline that I'm extremely interested in kind of accelerating. So there's an especially bad bottleneck right after kind of conceptual research, turning that into early prototypes and proofs of concept. There's very little investment there. It's kind of way too early for
And to be
VC.
clear, when we're talking about science here, capital S, we're talking about academia, we're talking about researchers, we're talking about like physical sciences.
Yeah, so like coming up with some important breakthrough, whether it's in physics or communications or computer science or something like that. There's a lot of academic research that produces good conceptual results, but yet those don't end up translating into improving our lives. And the problem is there's a bottleneck in between that conceptual research and getting into products.
So the connection from your interest in improving the scientific process and your interest in sort of improving the information flow process, generally speaking, is intriguing. There's one thing that really jumps out when I was looking at your resume. A very early experience with cancer research.
Yeah.
A very high data set branch of research. And I couldn't help but wonder if some of if that early internship informed you in any way as you were kind of looking at solving these information flows.
Yeah, absolutely. So and kind of why I got into doing that cancer research was that just in a broad sense, I'm a very strong technological optimist where when I study history over the last few centuries, there's just so many examples where really important scientific and technological breakthroughs have dramatically improved how society lives. Think of all our mortality is down, child mortality is down, tons of diseases have been cured, and so on. So our lives are getting dramatically better thanks to science and technology. And so I wanted to kind of go into one of these different areas to try and push. What I found as I did this cancer research was that there were extremely innovative ideas and really good conceptual breakthroughs, but they were 20 to 40 years away from actually saving anybody's lives. And I got kind of exposed to how slow the scientific and technological pipeline is. And so that was just kind of extremely demoralizing because you see how, even though there's millions of people working across this pipeline, trying to save people's lives, trying to do the work, there are structural inefficiencies that slow down the whole thing and prevent some of those really important breakthroughs translating into people actually receiving the benefits.
So a bunch of brilliant people doing work that they really care about, that could possibly change the world, that is getting caught up because of bad technology and bureaucracy.
Well, I think it's more economic. I
Okay.
think it's more of an economic structure
Okay.
that there isn't. It is not very profitable at all to do the deep long-term fundamental development piece of going from early conceptual research into some product. So we kind of have two very large incentive fields here. One is, of course, the incentive field of you build a product and you create a company and you can sell something into the market, and then that creates an incentive for profit and that for corporations and people and so on. The other incentive that covers the early part of the pipeline is just academic credit. So a lot of universities and researchers and so on do their work and they get sort of rewarded with academic credit as a currency, which they can then use to raise more funding and hire more researchers for their lab and so on. And in between these two incentives where they sort of meet, there's a gap. And there's no significant academic credit for doing translation work of taking some conceptually interesting result that has already happened, that people already wrote the paper for, and turning that into some actual breakthrough that can get commercialized. And when you look deeper at the shape of most innovations, usually sometimes between 5 to 20 times more work lies in that area of turning that initial conceptual breakthrough into something that you can actually put into a product. And that area is extremely expensive and way too far away, way too early for venture capital. So venture capital is often seen as like the earliest, craziest money that will go into funding like the future. And that's seen that way by most other investors in the economic landscape. And even VC is like way too late stage for this.
So a couple of words jumped out to me there. The economic structure for projects for long-term projects. Fascinating concept there. Something that I think heavily relates to your work. So I want to use that as kind of a bridge to what you're doing today. But we're going to just go 6 months before. All right. So as I see the official launch date of Protocol Labs, March 2014, let's go 6 months before that. All right. What were you doing what were you doing? What were you thinking? What were you experiencing that led you to 6 months later launch Protocol Labs to reimagine the nature of that information?
Great question. So previous to that, like about a year and a half before, I'd been working on a startup for mapping knowledge. And I'd actually started that with a few co-founders that are now super well-known and successful in
give
this
us
space and other
names.
places.
Give us some names.
Actually, Ali Yahya, who's now a GP at Andreessen.
Cool.
And one other person, Grant Sanderson from Triple and Brown.
Cool.
And a few other people. Those are the ones that are maybe well-known that
Yeah.
And the
mapping information.
So what we got to was we tried to build this product. And this was around the era where Udacity and Coursera had just come out and had raised a ton of money to try and kind of build educational platforms. And so they had sort of dried up a lot of the funding in the space. And so we were building a product, and
the space being
education and knowledge mapping.
Okay,
so
cool.
So this was like a very kind of intense era where a lot of people started reimagining how learning could be done through the internet. And so we tried a lot of things, and we had a really compelling product where you could. The idea was that you could kind of think about the dependencies of knowledge and say, hey, I want to learn what machine learning is and how to do it, and they would figure out the dependencies going into, say, linear algebra and computer science and statistics and so on, and then figure out what you know, and then teach you the rest of the concepts all the way through. But yeah, so we struggled with that for quite a while because the funding was dried up in the space, and so that gave me a sense of like
it's
how
a tough
important
problem.
Yeah.
Even if you've got a lot of money.
Yeah. And so we had some early versions of the product and just quite couldn't get product market fit, and so we ended up that project ended up failing. And so out of that, we were all broke at the time because we had spent our money building this thing. So I was doing some open source contributions to a lot of projects. I'd been very intensely in open source.
For people that don't know, when you say open source contributions, just very quickly.
I just mean working with a lot of other people on the internet to improve software that's online, freely accessible for everybody.
Great.
So
Okay.
There's open source is this way of creating software together and maintaining it together, because we all benefit from the maintenance of one thing.
Okay.
So it's the production of public goods and on the internet. And so I was working on a number of things related to information distribution, and versioning of data sets and so on. And that kind of got me to encounter a set of problems around how large scale data sets move. Because part of the reason why I was trying to do this knowledge mapping thing and um, was to try and accelerate the rate of progress.
So
So
it's
the common theme is like this R&D, trying to accelerate R&D.
I love it. So it's one thing to found a company to solve a problem, which technically is what you did, but it's also an entirely different thing to create a new technology to reimagine the way the internet works. What was it that happened in those, again, like a month or 2 months before you officially launched, where you're like, you know what? This isn't just a company. This is going to be a network of companies and an open source protocol that will reimagine the way the internet works. That's an audacious thing to go after. What happened to make you go from this is bigger than just a company, I'm going to redo the internet?
Great question. So I think it kind of it sort of started with IPFS, and once the kind
IPFS
of
being
ideas, the interplanetary file system, so
one
it's
of your
the
products.
protocols
Yeah.
that we make. And once I sort of put the ideas together for that, it was so compelling, and it kind of had to exist to the point where I just had to drop everything else and go build it. And I started Protocol Labs in order to build IPFS. And at the time, Bitcoin was starting. Bitcoin had already started and was, I guess, 3 or 4 years in, and was starting to get some strong interest. And so I wanted to incentivize the distribution of content on IPFS using something like Bitcoin.
Oh, cool.
And as I dug deeper into the Bitcoin protocol, I realized that you could actually use the same structure of the Bitcoin protocol, but incentivize the distribution of content.
So I didn't realize that IPFS was the origin point for Protocol Labs. So in that case, I have to go back one more time, because we can't even talk about what IPFS is until we've talked about what the internet is. And you've become very good at explaining every layer of the internet in a way that sort of demonstrates the problems that many of us sense, but maybe aren't able to put our finger on. Briefly, for my mom and dad, for people that maybe don't pay attention at the nuance, like how would you describe the way the internet works today, and what are the 1 or 2 vulnerabilities in that structure that you think maybe can be solved?
So the internet is this massive network of computers, and they're all talking to each other and passing around messages. And you turn your requests, so say you're trying to go to a particular website, and you're kind of querying the rest of the network. The requests tend to follow a certain set of rule sets and guidelines called protocols. And those protocols tend to either be more centralized or decentralized. And so centralized, they will have some kind of requirements to go to specific parties or specific companies and so on. It will kind of depend on those middlemen effectively. Or they will be more decentralized in that they might query a lot of different computers, not really put the power on a particular party and so on. And so when you request a page, and so this could be like, my picture on Facebook or something like that, your requests get immediately sent to Facebook servers to try and get that picture. But if that picture is the same picture that exists in other websites or in other computers and so on, today the web will still transfer all of the requests to Facebook, and that creates an enormous amount of power on Facebook and all of the data sets.
Awesome. Before we get to the possible solutions here, can you give 1 or 2 examples from the real world of a nation, a government, a country where the way that the internet works went wrong?
Yeah.
Just so we can feel the problem a little bit.
Many great examples. So one, there's been many countries that have shut down the internet and internet access because of some important civil problem. So a population is sort of unhappy with their government, they rise up in some way, and the government's response is to shut down the internet communication to prevent people from organizing. And we've seen this in many important social movements. So
are there 1 or 2 specifics that jump out to you as particularly visceral examples of when the internet got shut down?
Yeah. So there were a number of cases like this in the Arab Spring. I think it was Egypt, if I'm may not be remember correctly. I think it was Egypt. Yeah. That was very visceral for me because I kind of like lived through that and had friends who went through that. And more recently, Iran tried to shut down the social networks with women's movement rising up again.
And going back to your description of the way that the internet is currently structured, how was it that the way that the internet was structured specifically allowed those nations to briefly turn off the internet, and how might the work that you're doing change?
Yeah, so I'll use another very concrete example. So the Spanish government tried to block the polling locations for the Catalan referendum. So a few years ago, Catalonia was trying to issue a referendum.
Catalonia, a region
Yep.
in near Spain,
a region in Spain
on,
around Barcelona,
yeah,
has been separatist for, I don't know, the last few hundreds, since the beginning, probably 500-600 years or more, and has been. So they tried to issue a referendum to see if they wanted to prefer to be independent. The central government in Madrid didn't want this, kind of outlawed the referendum, and then tried to prevent people from even disseminating information about it. And so this was a very interesting case, because the way that they did it was that they wanted to block the domain name resolution. So this is when you type something like, some website.com, how your computer figures out what other computers to talk to resolve that company.com. That's called the domain name system. So they attacked that part of the puzzle, and they were able to do this because they control just a specific set of servers that allow that resolution, or that can filter traffic for that kind of thing. And what people in the ground did in Catalonia to get around this was that they actually used IPFS, the tech that we built.
cool.
And they made the website such that anybody who was hosting it could distribute it. So it changed the structure of how the requests are made. So the parties trying to request information could broadcast those requests to many other participants, and whoever had that information could reply to it, as opposed to just having to go through one choke point that could be shut down.
Awesome. So now with that long but very necessary context, we can talk about what IPFS is. All right.
Yeah.
So first of all, what does IPFS stand for? And second of all, again, for my mom and dad, if we can, try and explain what it is.
Yep. So IPFS stands for the Interplanetary File System, and that comes from trying to model, like the internet should work as well around the globe as cross planets. And so the idea of interplanetary here says that in a network that has very long delays, you wouldn't want a central party on another planet to control your communications. So if the content is right next to you physically, you should be able to get the content from them right away. You shouldn't have to go all the way to Mars and back to request content. And the internet kind of works that way today. Like if you are working on a shared document, for example, like a Google Doc or something like that, all of your requests, even if we're collaborating on the same room in two different laptops, all of our requests are going to go all the way to Google servers and back, which in computer time is like going all the way to Mars. And so ideally, the computer network should be able to just route a request directly, and we should be able to collaborate on our applications that way.
And when you say it's like going to Mars, it's because it should take a billionth of a second, and instead it takes 3 seconds. And even if 3 seconds feels really quick, compared to a billionth of a second, it's eon.
Yeah, exactly. So the difference. So here in this room, we might have a delay of like about 1 to 4 milliseconds going from one computer to another. Going all the way to Google servers might be like 100 to 300 milliseconds or something like that.
And so what is the IPFS? Is it software? Is it hardware? Is it on my computer? Is it on my family's computers? Do you have to download it?
Yeah, so
what is IPFS?
So it's a set of protocols with some accompanying software, and all of these are kind of open source libraries that anyone can use, that then gets put into other pieces of software. So think of it kind of like as a core of protocols called like a network stack. Most of the internet is built this way. That you can then add to products. So you can add it to browsers, you can add it to applications and so on, to then interconnect your applications and your systems this way.
And let's talk a little bit about usage before we get on to some of the other products that you're building. So how do we measure IPFS's usage? What are the metrics? And perhaps more importantly, if you were to compare that to some of your biggest competitors, who are those competitors and how do you compare?
Yeah. So the way you would measure usage is you can look at a few different things. You can look at how many applications out there are using it, how many nodes are there in the network, how many requests are moving through these networks. And so we run one gateway, which is a specific node that helps translate the traffic from normal web browsers that are not yet IPFS enabled to services and websites and so on that are hosted with IPFS. And just within that, we get billions of requests per week, and the number of like individual independent browsers, so different people that are interacting with this, oscillates between 10 to 100 million parties. So that's kind of like the broad range end user impact of IPFS.
What about from a storage perspective? Like how much data is currently stored in IPFS?
So IPFS has a ton of data because it includes within it the FACO network. The FACO network is the largest network within IPFS, and that's about 600 now petabytes of storage. So that's an enormous amount of data. Though most of the data that gets requested is actually very little. So the content on the network follows this weird distribution where a tiny little slice of the content gets requested tons of times, and most content only gets requested a few times. So think of like old archives. Like you might take tons of pictures and tons of video, but you see a few of them a lot, and most of them you never see again.
Is it an oversimplification to call this like a network of laptops that are all linked together, sharing their unused storage space?
It's laptops and servers and any computer really. So it could be any computer that people bring into the network.
So you haven't used the word cloud computing yet, but it feels a lot like cloud computing without a central entity. Is that?
It's kind of like creating a public cloud, like a really actually public cloud built together through a group of people bringing together their computers. And you can use markets to organize that, right?
So are you competing against Google and Microsoft and Amazon?
Yeah. So we want to create a cloud computing environment that is decentralized, that is not where applications and users and so on don't have to depend on those specific companies, and you can build applications in a disintermediated way. So think of like how many applications from those players or others have been shut down because they don't want to support that one thing anymore, or some service has to rehome somewhere else. So we want to build applications that are persistent and reliant, and you can depend on in the long term.
So you called it a public cloud. I can just hear the skeptics out there like, you're a company, you can't be a public cloud. Like, what are the incentive mechanisms in place that ensure that this network of computers are going to stay linked together, and B, that you guys can stay open for business? How does that work?
So one piece is to create a network where anybody can talk to each other and where you can get the information from each other. Now, you still need incentives to cause that information to move around. So, for example, if you and I are collaborating on the same document, we have an incentive to share the information to each other because we're interested in collaborating on that piece. However, you still need large-scale infrastructure that is very efficient to store our archives of data, or to serve content to us really quickly and so on. And you need to incentivize that activity. And so this is not just where sort of like peer-to-peer failed in the past, was that it sort of expected everybody to contribute the same amount. And in reality, markets solve that problem. Right? You can create a market where people can bring in resources and efficiency and get paid for doing so. And so that's what the FACO network is for. It's a subset of the IPFS network that creates this structure where you can pay participants for storing your data or serving it to you. And if you have a lot of hardware to contribute to the network, you can get paid for.
So it's not free. But you're not paying Microsoft.
IPFS is free. FACO is not free.
Okay. So do you have to buy the Filecoin then to use IPFS?
So you can use IPFS without Filecoin. These are two separate protocols. So when we make internet protocols, we tend to create these layers where there's kind of independence between them. And so IPFS is just a way of addressing and moving data that anybody can use for with any kind of incentive model, whether it's Filecoin or something else. And then a subset of that network is the Filecoin network that then is for pay. So that means if you're bringing storage to the network, then you can get paid for that. Or if you want to hire the network to store your content, then you pay those parties.
So I imagine that most of our listeners have not directly used the internet protocol, i.e. like written code for it, though they probably know what an IP address is. I imagine that, while they type in HTTPS, they might not have ever written any code for HTTPS, which is to say that adoption of that technology doesn't necessarily come from my mom and dad. For something like IPFS, for something like Filecoin, what does adoption look like? Are we talking about individuals downloading software? Are we talking about companies? Like, if the network of companies that is Internet Protocol, well, not Internet Protocol Labs, if the network of companies that is Protocol Labs takes over the world, is that companies that are doing it? Is that individuals? How does that look?
So it's applications and developers primarily, and then over time it gets into the infrastructure. So like you mentioned, most people use all kinds of protocols and even benefit from upgraded overgrazing protocols without ever noticing it. And that's the same thing for IPFS. Tons of people use IPFS that never know about it because it's just happening underneath the hood already on the browser or the websites that they talk to. So it's really about developer adoption. It's developers building applications on these networks.
So things were going along well. I think we should mention that back in 2017, you guys raised a decent chunk of money. So you had, was it roughly $200 million from traditional investors as well as through a token sale? Pretty big team. And then crypto winter comes along. Crypto winter, which I'll define quickly to save us some time, as a series of bankruptcies in the crypto space triggered by interconnected companies and some bad loans. But the fallout was big and it was real. And to this day, we're not 100% sure when it might end. Walk me through what Protocol Labs looked like as crypto winter happened, and like what has been the impact of crypto winter on your operation?
And for us, actually, macro winter is a bigger hit than crypto winter itself. So it's actually more about the broader global capital markets shifting. That is the bigger impact. So that ends up. So I think though there were some really big important crypto specific blowouts and so on. The broader impact in like the multi-year time horizon in the market is more the macro interest, like the inflation leading to high interest rates, and then that turning around tons of companies. Like there's just been stock market slash super heavily, tons of companies decrease their revenues and so on.
And so let's just very quickly. So how did macro winter impact Protocol Labs? Just one example. And how did crypto winter impact Protocol Labs?
So it impacts us in a few ways. So one is we decrease our invest. So we tend to invest or give grants to a lot of groups that are working across protocols. And so we have to decrease a number of that, all of that. We also had to lay off a number of folks. Like it was really sucks. A lot of really great folks that contributed a ton to our systems, along with a few other 1,000 companies. We had to kind of reduce our burn to kind of have a much longer runway through the macro winter. So those are the big
what does your runway look like? Are you guys okay?
Yeah, no, we're fine. It's just more of we have to plan for a longer term, and we have to be able to absorb shocks. So it's one of these cases where the prudent thing to do is to not assume that markets will recover by a particular date or a particular rate of time. And so you have to be able to withstand like severe shocks. Like what happens, say, if the war in Ukraine escalates and drags in another group, and then that worsens the macro winter? What happens if inflation doesn't keep coming down and the rates keep going up? All of these kinds of things tend to affect our outlook, and so then we have to manage our cash flows and so on.
So going back to your earlier comments about business models for projects that take a long time.
Yeah.
It's a good thing you were already thinking about that.
Yeah.
And perhaps no coincidence. How long did it take the internet to get to where it is today? And do you think your runway is that long?
Oh man. Well, so it's a great point. So the internet took about 40 to 60 years to scale.
Okay.
Like, I mean, the beginning of it was the 60s and 70s. And
that was largely jump-started by academia and universities, and then the private sector kind of like came in later. So is it fair? Like, is Protocol Labs kind of filling the role of academia and the government?
No, so thankfully, in our case, we don't have to do very early academic work. We have some amount of academic research in deep areas of cryptography for Filecoin, but for the most part, most of our tech doesn't depend on that. So we can really just focus on that kind of bottleneck part that I described, the fundamental development piece. And no, I mean, like for us, like adoption is already super high and growing. It's just a matter of staying the course on that and continuing to scale it.
How does like as a I don't know how you measure this as a percentage of the internet? How
Yes.
does adoption look compared
Like
to
to
say
say,
Microsoft, Google, Amazon, the other big cloud?
yeah, it's a great question. So the Falcon Network launched in 2020, and so that's yeah, gonna come up in 3 years this year, and it is one of the fastest growing storage networks on the planet. It amassed over 15 exabytes of storage in about a year. I don't know that any other large scale network grew that quickly, including the centralized parties. And that's a couple percentage points of the total storage in the world. So like that's a pretty large scale for a decentralized network. So uh, already Falcon is vastly larger than all of the rest of Web3 put together.
And what what happens like? You're building essentially public infrastructure, right? Like what you are building is it all open source? You're basically you're building it and giving it
Yes.
away.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So we build protocols in open source that anybody can use, and then we lean into market oriented protocols to organize large scale work. And Protocol Labs, the developing company, participates in the economy and is rewarded in the same asset as everybody
So
else.
when you say participates in the economy, obviously we're a business publication first and foremost. They let me talk about tech every now and then. Like what does your business model look like? And yeah, we'll go there first.
So in order to create Filecoin, we Protocol Labs itself got an allocation of tokens initially, and that's our revenue in a sense.
Okay, so you're not selling anything at this point.
We're not selling any other products. Like that's kind of our runways. It's kind of a weird business model that started with Ethereum and other groups, where participants in an economy like this, you can either provide hardware, you can provide code, you can provide many different kinds of contributions into the network, and you get paid for doing that.
So a certain amount of Filecoin was created. Some of it was given away to your investors. You guys kept a nest egg of it, and you're using that to stay
to develop. Yeah.
Okay, awesome. So that does kind of beg the question, especially like I like going back to the internet comparison. Like that was jump started by academics and governments working together largely. Private sector eventually came along. But like one could argue that without that early intervention and the investment from education and government, the creation of the internet would have been delayed.
Absolutely.
If not, like not at all,
Yes.
probably would have happened. But
it probably would have been very different. It probably wouldn't have been as open and free and public as it is today. Like think about the early AOL version of the internet and how everything was kind of guided and paywalled and so on. It was really painful and really frankly awful. Like the open protocols, open public oriented protocols came about because of that early academic and open source orientation.
And what happens to IPFS? What happens to Filecoin if Protocol Labs goes away?
So at this point, nothing. Like we are contributing on a set of things that anybody else can contribute. So we're one more participant. The Filecoin network now has many thousands of companies already around it. So most of those are storage providers that are running large scale facilities, storing data. There are many developers already. Like there's a couple hundred different entities that are developing different parts of the software. So if PL disappeared overnight or something like that, maybe some of the things that we're currently working on would get delayed, but other people would then step up and pick it up. So we're no longer running any kind of critical infrastructure or anything.
Very cool. How do you measure your success then?
So and this is what I think is extremely valuable about these kinds of protocols. They enable the creation of new infrastructure for the internet without but by funding the development of that infrastructure from the usage of the protocol itself. And that's an extremely powerful primitive. I think it's kind of a shame that more recently it's getting more locked down in the traditional capital flows, and instead continuing to be a much more public kind of infrastructure. I think that it has a ton of promise to be able to build many future iterations of these kinds of technologies in a much more open way, in a much more community oriented way, or in a way that is much more transparent and clear to everybody.
So last question, you talked about, I give a great example in Spain and Catalonia about the censorship resistance, so to speak. If you think big picture, if it took 50 years for the internet to get to where it is today, you guys have been around for 9 years. Well, let's just say 40 years from now, when you guys have been around for 50 years, like how do you hope that the internet will look different 40 years from now? And what happens if you fail? What happens if the internet doesn't change? What happens if things stay the way they are?
Yeah. So try to be. I'll try to be positive about it. Like the real risk here is a pretty dark one, which is that the level of information processing that modern nation states and even corporations have is so vastly powerful that and the treasure troves of information about what everybody does are so readily available that you can have nation states and individual corporations building sophisticated models of every human on Earth and predict their behavior and manipulate their behavior. And so I've toyed with the idea of writing kind of a sequel to 1984 and calling it 2024 or something like that, because you can create these Orwellian states that are tremendously powerful in manipulating large swaths of people. And what we need to do in order to prevent that outcome is to create a communications infrastructure that puts people in control of their data and puts people in control of who gets access to their information and why and how and so on. And we have to kind of fix the incentive model of content distribution. Like the Cambridge Analytica problem of rife manipulation in the world happened because of the ad model. And those two are interlinked. While we maintain most of the content distribution in the world happening through ads, we'll continue having that manipulation problem. And so if we want to kind of prevent those kind of really bad outcomes, we have to build a much better infrastructure for humanity.
You mentioned Cambridge Analytica, which had some fallout, big fallout regarding its work with Facebook. I actually think that big centralized social networks are a great example, generally speaking, of a lot of the risks that you're talking about, which does kind of beg the question. I just have to ask one more follow-up. With the recent struggles of Twitter in response to, in large part to Elon Musk's acquisition, we saw a brief but very meaningful spike of people moving to a decentralized competitor, a network of implementations on an open source infrastructure called Mastodon. Interestingly, Mastodon does not have a cryptocurrency. I'm curious, these decentralized networks that don't rely on a crypto incentive, what are your thoughts on those? Are they the future? Might you ever move to something like that? Or do you think that
I think you can definitely build pretty significant services using other kinds of incentive models. I think to reach the level of scale of something like Twitter, you need to enable participants to make that service really efficient. And that's where you need to really pay people to do that. Like, I think division of labor is a requirement. Like, in order to get extremely high efficiency in systems, you do need to do that. You need to employ structures like markets or some other way of coordinating people. And so I think that in the long term, we will see that. I think the reason why people move to say Mastodon and other types of things is because there is no crypto-based social network yet that can scale to that rate. It's because the tech's not there yet. So I actually don't think. I think that you can't today build a Twitter-like thing at that scale yet. But I think that we will be able to within 2 to 3 years.
When you're blowing off steam, what do you do for fun?
I really like going around in nature, reading books, sci-fi.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for taking the time to speak today. Please do keep us posted.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me.